Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Tales from the Darkness. Gather round and try to stay in the light. Some of the others from the dark aren't quite as civil as I am, and I hate cleaning up that mess. Now, I thought it might be nice to try something a bit different this time. Please let me know what you think of it in the comments down below. The Deerians, from Panthera 2K1. You may have heard stories about skinwalkers, Native American witches or spirits that turn themselves into animals to cause harm. But at the lake where I spent the larger portion of my childhood summers, they went by a different name, Deerians. The story has faded from most families at the lake over time, but mine still recites it in hushed whispers around the campfire. The legend of the Deerians begins sometime in the 18th century. Settlers from Europe flocked to northern Michigan with hopes of getting a head start on the fur trade. That's when they found the lake. And at that lake, there were native tribes. Most were welcoming and hospitable. Others were quiet and kept to themselves. But most were kind. Most. There was one tribe, a single tribe that resided in the swamps on the western side of the lake, and they were vicious. They would attack anyone who strayed too far into the swamp. Man, woman, child, settler, even other tribes. Nobody knew why they were so aggressive, and they tried to leave them alone, but the attacks added up. And then followed the deaths and disappearances, and the settlers had had enough. They began to set up traps and ambushes in the swamps where they knew the tribe would be, common hunting grounds, pathways, even the village itself. But they were all always abandoned, inhabited only by a herd of white-tailed deer. Sometimes people never came home from the swamp. They'd go missing for days on end, but would later be found, completely mangled. Most blamed wolves or bears or mountain lions, but upon further inspection, the only tracks that would ever be found in the area belonged to deer. But that's not the story. No, my story takes place hundreds of years after the deaths and disappearances of French settlers. I had always dismissed the stories of the Deerians as just that, stories. Tales to frighten wide-eyed children and keep them within the confines of the family property. But one evening changed all of that completely. Bald eagles are a common sight at the lake, but their nests are not that easy to find. Therefore, when my cousin said he found a nest while he was kayaking along the river that ran through the swamp, my dad and I naturally wanted to see it. We hopped into the rickety old canoe and, with what little daylight we had left, set off towards the swamp. As we approached, we noticed something. It was a doe, drinking peacefully from the water. She didn't notice us at first, but something made her look up and notice my dad and me. And it was at that moment I knew something was up. White-tailed deer are another dime a dozen animal at the lake, though if you get more than about 100 feet from one, they take off. But this deer was different. She just stood there. And as we got closer, I could tell this deer was wrong. She looked as if a child had read about a deer one time in a book, then drew one from what little they understood. I got close enough to this deer that I could almost touch her, but then she calmly turned and walked like a marionette into the woods. Dad and I looked at each other, but laughed it off. It was nothing, it had to be. Just some deformed deer. We entered the river, and immediately I was hit with a wall of sound. Birds, crickets, and cicadas accompanied us on our journey. And as we turned the first bend, I heard something in the tall grass to my right, rustling. A big animal. Perhaps that malformed deer. My dad didn't seem to notice, but I listened closely. Rustling. Then, to my surprise, a low whisper, and with a hyena-like giggle, the thing ran off into the woods. I felt uneasy. I felt watched. I wanted to tell Dad, but I was worried he'd tease me, so we just kept paddling. Eventually, we stopped to rest. We scanned the tops of the trees for the eagle nest until we noticed something. The swamp, which had previously been bustling with life, was empty. No birds, no crickets, no cicadas, no noise at all. until I heard another low whisper from the grass to my right, then another to the left, then giggling all around. I no longer felt watched. I felt hunted. Something splashed into the water behind me, but by the time I turned and looked, all I saw were the tracks of a deer. I looked at Dad, who I'd never seen afraid before, and I knew he was absolutely terrified. We began to paddle for dear life, and with that, the swamp roared to life. We paddled against the current as birds dive-bombed us and insects swarmed us, and the giggling was all around. We paddled for what seemed like an eternity, until suddenly, silence. Dad and I were in the open lake, safely away from the confines of the swamp. I took the time to try and calm myself down until something plunked into the water beside me. I looked and saw an arrowhead sinking slowly into the shallow water of the bay. I hesitantly turned to seek its source and only saw a stag, walking like a marionette, disappear into the swamp. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this somewhat different episode. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more. Don't forget you can also listen to these stories on Spotify, link in the description down below. Let me know what you think of this different style of video, and as always, pleasant dreams.